Hello everyone, today we are talking about Kingdom Protista, dear Kingdom Protista. Now, let me preface this lesson by saying, if you feel a little bit lost and confused, that's okay, because you know what? Kingdom Protista, anything in there is also a little bit lost and confused. They just need a home. Let's talk about that. As far as what you should be taking from this lesson, there's a few things. So the goal is to be able to distinguish between the three groups of protists. So there's three groups: animal, fungus, and plant-like. We'll get into that later. You need to know some of the movement types for animals, fungus, and plant-like protists. You need to know some of the options for reproduction for animal, fungus, and plant-like. And you need to know sort of physical structure. Are they unicellular or multicellular, and what specific structural characteristics do certain representative organisms have? You also need to know the representative organisms. Protists were the earliest eukaryotes. Proto means first, so protists were our first eukaryotes. Now there's this really cool theory called endosymbiosis, which basically explains how eukaryotic cells evolved from the symbiotic relationship between two or more prokaryotic cells. Basically, it says that a prokaryotic cell once entered another cell, and they became reliant on each other to a point of symbiosis. And these initial prokaryotic cells later became our current day chloroplasts or mitochondria. And over time, these prokaryotic cells became so reliant that they're no longer considered a cell themselves, they're just considered organelles within our current eukaryotic cells. Okay, now protists are single-handedly the most diverse eukaryotes. Okay, they're known as the biological junk drawer. You know that junk drawer your parents might have in the kitchen where all the random stuff gets thrown into? That's protists. Protists are eukaryotic organisms that don't fit into any other category. They're not plants, they're not fungus, they're not animals, they're protists. Now, keep in mind that biological junk drawer as we go through some of the characteristics, because they can be unicellular, like bacteria, or they can be multicellular, so they can be both. Some of them will also form colonies, so unicellular colonies, which is slightly different from multicellular. Some are going to have cell walls, just like plants do, though their cell walls are often composed of different things. Some are motile, which means they move. Some aren't motile. There's a large range in sizes. So it's really important to know that protists are the most diverse eukaryotes. That being said, bacteria are generally considered to be the most diverse in general. Now, in our images over here, we have a happy little unicellular protist. It might be Euglena, though I don't see flagella necessarily, so I'm not too sure. And then over here, we have a seaweed, which is another type of protist. Now, when we're classifying protists, it gets a little bit messy because, remember, they're our biological junk drawer. So we're going to focus largely on three types. We have animal-like, plant-like, and fungi. There are lots of different phyla because they're so diverse. If you take a look at our phylogenetic tree, there are just some examples. We are going to be talking about, let's see, euglenoids, dinoflagellates, ciliates, diatoms. We've got some molds in there. And that's all I see right now. So we're going to be talking about a few examples from each of these classification levels. First up, we have animal-like protists. So protists that are kind of like animals, but they're not close enough to animals to be able to be placed within the animal category. We call them protozoans. Protozoans, which just means little animal. Many animal-like protists are unicellular, though not necessarily all of them. Now, animal-like protists are unique from some of the other protists because they're heterotrophic. They are usually consuming other microbes. What this means is that they are going to be using their vacuoles to digest food. We're going to be looking at 4 types of animal-like protists down here. One thing is that we will be looking at one type that sort of goes by lots of different names. Okay, let me correct that. It's not that they're necessarily lots of different names, but it's, for our purposes, you might run into a variety of different vocabulary, including rhizopods, sarcodina, and amoeboids. And it just describes sort of different classifications. We're not going to get too hung up on the details, but just so you know, there are some different terminologies that you might see while doing some research. Okay, so to move on, we also have ciliates. They have cilia. We have flagellates. They have flagella. And we have sporozoans. They have spores. So the first animal-like protist group that I want to talk about is our sarcodina. Now, that's the one where I said you might run into a few different terminology, including rhizopods or amoeboids. They're all sort of talking about this category. Basically, this category use pseudopodia, which means false feet. So they're like little pseudopods, fake feet, helping the animal to move around. So our sarcodina are all motile. They all move using pseudopods. Now, our representative organism, or representative protist, for this group is the amoeba, a very important organism that we just love to talk about. Amoeba use pseudopods to move because they're part of this sarcodina sort of grouping. A really good video that I would encourage you to watch is this one. Here is a still shot from this video showing us an amoeba. So these little projections here are pseudopods. You will notice that there's more than one. So the amoeba can create several pseudopods at one time. There's 2 pieces of terminology here that are important to know, which are ectoplasm and endoplasm. The endoplasm is a much more fluid or watery substance that is located closer towards the inside of the cell, and it's the part that when you're watching this video will appear more fluid and quicker moving. The ectoplasm, on the other hand, is sort of like a clear gel and is found on the sort of outer parts of the cytoplasm of the cell. And so try and identify the ectoplasm and the endoplasm when watching that video. If we zoom in on this pseudopod right here, there's a really good sort of defining line between ectoplasm and endoplasm. That endoplasm is that sort of granular substance right there. And the ectoplasm is this, drawn in blue, sort of outer gel-like area. Let's move on to our next animal-like protist. Our next animal-like protist are ciliates. Ciliates have acilia. Sorry, not acilia. They are covered in cilia. And you can see them on this image right around the periphery of the cells. They line the cells and they beat kind of like oars in a boat. And when you beat the oars at the same time, then the boat is able to move forward. And so that's exactly what cilia do. And as a result, they move very quickly. Like all our other animal-like protists, they are heterotrophic, so they eat other types of organisms. Okay, there might be a bit of a jump in the slide. I had to get rid of a bit of type that hung out with me. So our representative organism for ciliates is the paramecium. So take a look at our video. It will show you exactly what moving cilia will look like. Now, paramecium have a few distinguishing structures that might be sort of new to you. So one of them is the contractile vacuole. Now, I'm sure you would have heard of vacuoles before, except it's a little different than normal vacuoles because it helps to regulate how much water is in the cell. And what it will do is it will gather any extra water and then contract, pushing it out of the cell, sort of like a bail bucket. If you're ever in a boat and there's too much water, you want to make sure you have a bail bucket. There is also a structure right here called the oral groove. And this oral groove just is where nutrients are taken into the paramecium. There's also something called the gullet, which is at the end of the oral groove, sort of. And the gullet takes in the nutrients, the food, and eventually it will break off and create a food vacuole. Our next animal-like protist is the flagellates. They're usually the smallest of the protozoa or animal-like protists, and they always will have one or more long whip-like flagella. They're always going to have at least one flagella, and you can see that flagella down in our image right here, and these might also be flagella. And so that's how they move, that's how they're motile. Our representative organism for flagellates is Giardia. So please take a look at the video of two flagellates dancing. Our last animal-like protist is the sporozoans. Now, like their name says, spore, well, they have spores somewhere in their life cycle. These sporozoans are parasitic and rely on a host for reproduction. These sporozoans do not have a flagella, do not have a cilia or pseudopods, but they still move. They kind of glide. So they're still motile, but they have a gliding mechanism that uses different motor filaments in the cell. And finally, our representative host organism for this group is the plasmodium, or plasmodia, if we're talking about singular. And that's it for animal-like protists. Here we move on to our plant-like protists. Plant-like protists are algae. They're algae. And they're also autotrophic. If you recall, that means they're able to use, to make their own food. In this case, they do actually use chloroplasts. Most plant-like protists are unicellular. Some can be colonial, where they unicellular organisms bunch up into colonies, and some can be multicellular. So up here we have an image of diatoms, which are unicellular organisms. Here is another example of a unicellular organism, and I'm sure you know what seaweed looks like. Plant-like protists are really important for a few reasons. The first is that they produce most of Earth's oxygen. You may have heard of the word phytoplankton before. Phytoplankton act as the base of ecosystems, or the food base of food webs. Some phytoplankton are plant-like protists. So these plant-like protists are really important for food webs and for producing oxygen. Now, I mentioned that plant-like protists are algae. Well, some of the groups within plant-like protists are algae. We have red algae, brown algae, and green algae. Now, when you think of algae, this is generally what you're going to be thinking of. And there's a few differences between red algae, brown algae, and green algae. So for example, red algae are usually tropical marine organisms, and they will form several different types of seaweed. Brown algae are usually the largest types of algae. So for example, there's a species called Micrositis perifera, and the common name of that species is actually giant kelp. So when you see giant kelp forests, it's probably going to be brown algae. And brown algae actually has differentiated tissues, which means tissues that have different functions or purposes, comparable to how humans have differentiated tissues. And finally, we have the green algae, which are usually in freshwater environments, though can be marine. And they can be unicellular or multicellular, and they can even have flagella. Our next type of plant-like protists are euglenoids. So before we had the algae that, kind of look like algae, they are what you expect to see. Euglenoids aren't necessarily what you think of when you think of algae in the sort of common sense of the word. Euglenoids are unicellular. They have a flagella. You can see it down here. And they can also ingest food if there's no sunlight. So for this reason, they're a little bit of a classification conundrum, because they can do some of the things that animal-like protists do, but they also photosynthesize. So for today, we're going to say that they are plant-like protists. Now, euglena have some interesting organelles, including the flagellum that we've already talked about, and the contractile vacuole, which helps to regulate how much water is in the cell. It acts like a bail bucket. And the last thing it has is this eye spot. This eye spot acts as a photoreceptor, which means it receives light. So it allows the euglena to detect light and allows the euglena to move towards light, which is important when you're a photosynthetic organism. If we scroll back to our last slide and zoom in on this picture here, what you can see are these little eye spots in red. Now, it appears to be red because it has certain pigments in it that allow us to see this red color, similar to why chloroplasts allow us to see them as green. They have a pigment called chlorophyll. Depending on what image you're looking at, you might not always be able to see this vibrant red color. Next up on plant-like protists are the diatoms. Now, diatoms are unicellular. You can see that in the images down below. And they come in lots of different shapes and sizes. One defining characteristic of diatoms is that their cell wall is made out of glass. So their cell wall is made up of silica, which is the same stuff that glass is made out of. And so what you end up with are these really pretty shapes that are just really pretty to look at. Okay, our final plant-like protist are our dinoflagellates. Now you may notice I have the same images down here. That's a mistake. Those are our diatoms, of course, so just ignore those images. Dinoflagellates are unicellular and have two flagella that are dissimilar. So usually they're different sizes or coming out of different places. They're not the exact same. The other thing is that they form something called red tides. Another word for this is, or another name for this is fire algae, and they produce toxins. So here's an image of a red tide. A red tide is basically just an algae bloom, which means algae replicated or reproduced really, really quickly, and there's so much of them. As a result, they discolor the water. There is so much algae that you can actually see it right there. And so some can also create bioluminescence. If you remember grade 10 science, you might remember the term. Bioluminescence means light created from living creatures. And so here's a video of a guy surfing in a red tide where you can observe bioluminescence. It's pretty neat. Go check it out. Okay, our final protist is a fungus-like protist. So that means they're like fungi. Now, fungus-like protists are heterotrophic, and they mainly live on decaying matter in terrestrial or aquatic environments. That being said, this is our biological junk drawer, so some of these fungus-like protists can also eat living organisms. Now, our fungus-like protists are similar to fungi because they also have cell walls, usually, and they also usually form spores at some point in their lifetime. Most fungus-like protists will use pseudopods. Those are the same thing as the amoeba. And as our representative organisms, we have the slime molds and the water molds. There's a pretty interesting video that talks about slime molds if you want to learn a little bit more about them. Okay, so to summarize, movement. There's three kinds that can happen in protists. There's cytoplasmic streaming, which involves that pseudopod. There's the flagella, like what the euglena uses, as well as what the flagellates use it, or the dinoflagellates. And there's the cilia, like the paramecium. Now, protists, our biological junk drawer, will use tons of different types of reproduction. So here are some reproduction methods of unicellular organisms. And you might be familiar with some of the terms. So the first is binary fission, which I've compared to mitosis. So in mitosis, we copy the genetic info, and that's the same thing for binary fission. But mitosis involves a nucleus, usually, and binary fission usually doesn't. But again, there are always exceptions in the magical world that we live in. So there's binary fission as a means of unicellular asexual reproduction. We also have multiple fission. Multiple fission is similar to binary fission, but where bi is two, so we get two identical cells, multiple means we get sort of three or more. And it's, again, asexual. And finally, we have conjugation, where it's as sexual as you can get with a unicellular reproduction method, and it's where two partners join and they're transferring genetic material. Now, with protists that are multicellular, so things like seaweed usually, their life cycles are more complex. So over here on the right, you see an image, and as you can tell, it's more complex than simple binary fission or multiple fission, whatever it may be. And it's split up into two sides. We have the blue side over here and the yellow side over here. And as you can see from the legend, the yellow side is a haploid stage. And on the blue side, it says it's a diploid stage. So diploid describes an organism or a cell that has paired chromosomes, where one chromosome comes from each parent. So for example, in humans, the cells of a human's body are going to be diploid. So we're blue over here, except our gametes or our sex cells. So human sex cells are sperm or eggs, and our sperm and eggs are actually called haploid. What haploid means is that there is a single set of chromosomes. And when there is a life cycle that cycles between being diploid over here in the blue and haploid over here in the yellow, we call that alternation of generations. So an example of an organism that has this alternation of generations is the brown algae. Remember that brown algae was that giant algae that created those giant kelp forests. So here's another example of that alternation of generation, but this time we're talking about it in the organism Plasmodium. Can you remember what type of protist that was? Pause the video, go check it out. Here's the answer. Plasmodium, if you recall from earlier, is one of the animal-like protists, specifically a sporozoan. Plasmodia also causes malaria, the disease. And so what happens is, when a mosquito that is carrying Plasmodium feeds off of a human's blood, the mosquito is also going to be passing a little bit of its saliva into the human. Within the saliva is something called a sporozoite. Remember, we call them sporozoans? So it's carrying a sporozoite, which is haploid. You can see because it's yellow, it's haploid. And these sporozoites are going to travel through the blood, and eventually they're going to make it to the liver. And here, the sporozoites are going to reproduce asexually. So here we have asexual reproduction. And this results in merozoites. It's just a different name and a slightly different cell. So these merozoites are going to enter the bloodstream and invade the red blood cells. Here, they will reproduce asexually again. So we are getting more and more merozoites being produced. Eventually, this will cause the red blood cells to die. Now, when cells die, as you know, that's when you're going to express a disease. And so that's when the symptoms are going to show up. So you're going to get the fevers and chills of malaria. The other thing that can happen is the merozoites can instead develop into our gametes. And so our gametes are those still haploid, but this time they're sort of meant for sexual reproduction, okay? So we have male and female gametes. And then we need a second mosquito to come and feed on this human, happy little human, well, maybe not so happy. And these gametes will enter the mosquito and form a zygote. So when two gametes fuse, we get a zygote. And this zygote can then go and produce those sporozoites. So to summarize, in this plasmodia life cycle, we're reproducing sexually and asexually. We are alternating our generation, so we're in haploid for part of it, all over here in yellow, and we are in diploid for part of it over here in blue. And we're also in 2 different organisms, including our unhappy little human and our happy little mosquito. So this alternation of generation life cycle is definitely complex, but it's something we're going to revisit now and again in the rest of the unit. It's worthwhile to talk about protists and their effect on other organisms. So we've talked about how they're really important for producing oxygen. They're often the base of food webs, and they play an important role in decomposing dead and decaying matter. But they can also be pathogenic, which just means they cause disease. So we have a few types that I wanted to highlight, including Giardia, which is a water protist that causes what's colloquially called beaver fever. So basically, it causes fever and diarrhea. There's also trympanosomes, which causes something called sleeping sickness, and of course our dear Plasmodium, which we've just talked about, causing malaria. So that's it for Kingdom Protista. At least that's all we're going to talk about. We talked about a lot. We talked about animal, plant-like, and fungus-like protists, as well as different categories within them and the representative organisms. We talked about some new terminology in terms of physical structure, like things that we see on the paramecium or the euglenoids. We talked about different ways that some of these representative organisms move. And we also talked about different ways that they can reproduce. Now, the major takeaway should really be that this is the biological junk drawer. There are exceptions galore in this kingdom. If it exists somewhere in the world, the protists probably do it. They are incredibly diverse organisms. But that's it for now. As always, let me know if you have any questions, and good luck.